Hey everyone! So recently I have been discussing racial or ethnic groups in Big Brother USA history, and I have made a video discussing black women, a video discussing black men, and a video discussing Italian men, since it's being clear that there's an archetypical casting trope that is being formulated around Italian men specifically. Though there are a few Italian women that kind of fit in that group as well, that I didn't discuss earlier. Anyway, so the point of this video is to discuss Asian house guests. And I have to group all the Asian house guests into one video because the sample size is just way too small. That's a huge issue with the casting of Big Brother USA, as they tend to generally focus on white house guests or black house guests. And if there's not a racial or ethnic group that doesn't fit into one of those two groups, they're usually Latino house guests. So, in order to talk about the Asian house guests, I have to break them down, since Asia is a huge continent with many different types of people in it. So, looking through the areas of Asia and the type of people that Big Brother has cast that are of Asian descent, I've noticed that there are four groups. There are Western Asians, Southern Asians, Southeast Asians, and Eastern Asians. So those are going to be the four groups of people I'm going to be discussing in this video. And I'm going to talk about the house guests within each group. So I'm going to talk about the Western Asians first, the Southern Asians second, or might not be in that order, Eastern Asians, and then Southeastern Asians. Overall, you kind of get the point. So let's get right to it. Okay, so the first group of people that I'm going to be talking about are West Asians. I was going to use the term Middle Eastern, but one of them don't fit in that category, and I've been told that they find that term very offensive. So I'm going to go with the more politically correct Western Asian title. So there are only five of them, or at least five that are known, that fit into this category, and there's actually a lot more Western Asians that are cast in Big Brother Canada than Big Brother USA, which is a problem because Big Brother USA has 14 more seasons than Big Brother Canada, but it says a lot that BB Can has more Western Asian people. So, just from my recollection of the five that are here, I noticed that the lighter skinned ones are treated better than the ones that are darker skinned, and we'll see how that is the case as I go through each of them. So, the first person that I'm going to discuss is Kaysar, who was on Big Brother 6, Big Brother 7, and Big Brother All Stars, and has never had a long run in any of the seasons. So he was immediately put on the outs in Big Brother 6 and was seen as untrustworthy. He was put on the block week 1 and was never allowed to integrate into the house, though he didn't give anyone any reason to not be seen as untrustworthy. Since this was a few years after 9/11, there was a lot of awkward conversations that he had to have in the house, specifically about Islamophobia and the events that were taking place in Iraq. You would see this with some of his conversations with James and Eric. And then there was, of course, the argument that happened between himself and Yvette that took place in week 2, where it culminated with her calling him a sand Nigg bleep bleep. I believe you can fill out the rest. And that obviously pissed him off, and then he stood up against her, and then things escalated. And on the live feed, she continued making racial slurs against him, his people, his religion, so on and so forth, throughout the entire season. But of course, we only got the one instance in the episodes. There really isn't anything to discuss pertaining his time in All Stars, but of course, a lot of the men didn't trust him, he was put on the outs, and he stood out a lot more compared to the majority white cast. There were even more awkward discussions about race in the second All Stars, since some didn't understand his perspective whatsoever, and he didn't completely understand the other people of color's perspectives and experiences as well. So there was a bit of that clash as well. Of course, people like Cody didn't trust him for some odd reason. And I remember Hamza from Big Brother Canada 6 commenting during the season that he felt like Kaysar was going through Islamophobia. For a very long time, he was the only Western Asian person to be on the show, and he clearly felt like he had to portray himself in a certain manner so he wouldn't embarrass his people due to the bad representation in media overall. So, the next person we are going to discuss is Russell from Big Brother 11. So, almost immediately, he was automatically deemed as untrustworthy by everyone in the house, even by the people in his alliance, before he even did anything. His alliance was willing to backdoor him in the second week, though at this point in the season, he was still very loyal to them. And of course, he had the clashes with Jeff, and everyone saw him as extremely aggressive due to his antics, which also didn't help because he was Middle Eastern as well, since most of the cast was aggressive, but it was made a huge deal with him specifically. Of course, on the show, we had that one argument between him and Chima where he was called a terrorist essentially, and of course, he calls out how bad she looks because you're accusing a Middle Eastern man of being a terrorist, especially with everything that has happened in that decade. And what's interesting, not in a good way, about this is that on the edit, production actually backed Chima up and tried to make it seem like it wasn't a racial slur. So they showed flashbacks of his arguments with several other people in the house. So you have Natalie chiming in that it wasn't a racist microaggression. But on the feeds, several of the house guests continued to call him a terrorist and other racist slurs. So Russell was clearly right about this, but they just hid it from the show and made it seem like it was only about his personality. So Russell was definitely given an aggressive edit, which he definitely played into, and he is rarely mentioned by production or future house guests as a Middle Eastern, North African, or just a West Asian person or a representative. He was overall very negatively portrayed on the show, and I don't think he really cared about how he was portrayed and wanting to be seen as a good role model. But essentially, production used him to exhibit negative portrayals of West Asian people. And I think that's why they kind of put him under the bed compared to some of the others. So the next person I'm going to discuss is Victoria from Big Brother 16. And it's sad that after 22 years, she's still the only Western Asian woman to be on the show. Though in Big Brother Canada, they more often cast Western Asian women compared to West Asian men. In general, I don't really recall there being much discussion pertaining to her ethnicity, which is interesting for the reasons that I've stated earlier. There was the situation where Frankie threatened to R her, which he was talking about with some of the other house guests. But I think that might be the only thing that might have been attached to her ethnicity. But you also had women like Nicole and Christine who hated on the non-white women on the season due to petty reasons, and Victoria was unfortunately a part of that list. So the fourth person in discussion is Paul. And he is the reason why I just didn't call this group Middle Eastern, outside of it being seen as offensive to some people. Because while he is from Armenia, the country technically isn't really seen as Middle Eastern, North African, or part of that group to many people. So I just went with Western Asian because it is a part of Western Asia. So in general, there was no mention of his race or ethnicity in either of his two seasons, but I'm wondering if that's the case because he's a lot more white passing compared to all the others in this group. He was a part of the POC newbie alliance that was formed but blew up immediately. He was seen as aggressive and untrustworthy in Big Brother 18, especially in the mid portion of the season where he had that argument with Michelle, but nothing of the sort came up in Big Brother 19 at all. And last but most certainly not least is Joseph from this current season of Big Brother 24. Before I even talk about his journey in the house, I have to talk about how they made him an alternate despite the fact that he's from a severely underrepresented group. And what made it worse is that they made him an alternate to a black man. What this says to me is that production and casting clearly sees Houseguests under two categories: white and POC. So they're just having POCs be alternate for one another, even if they're not the same race. But they felt comfortable going into this season with having 5 white men and 3 black men to be the 8 that was in the season, after they already got flagged for having a lack of Asian representation last season, with that season supposing to be the start of the new POC implementation rule. Now, about his actual journey in the house, he was immediately put on the outs in the eyes of pretty much everyone in the house, and he was seen as untrustworthy, though it was partially due to him not wanting to talk game. And I didn't mention this in Kaysar's section, but like Kaysar, Joseph was either seen as useless or sexualized in the eyes of many men and women in the house. So there's that dichotomy as well. So even in the early weeks, he was always grouped in with the black people, mainly Monty and Taylor, whenever ethnicity came up. And you see this a lot in Big Brother seasons, where if POCs talk to one another, they are automatically assumed to be closer than they really are in reality, or are almost always seen as threatening. So a lot of POC don't even feel like they can talk to one another visibly. So now we have to get into the main event of Kyle essentially accusing all the POCs of being in an alliance, though all the evidence suggested the contrary, with them sending one another home, them nominating one another, and he compared it to a cookout situation of the previous season, completely missing the point that the cookout was specifically about black representation, so grouping non-black people in that is problematic to say the least, and he doesn't even understand the nuances that different POC groups have their own journeys and their own experiences, as well as their own conflicts. This would be enabled by a lot of the white allies that Joseph was supposedly in an alliance with. They all kind of enabled this. He would be called, as well as the others, would be called bullies, scum, arrogant, aggressive, and that he, as well as others, would jump Kyle because they were arguing that he shouldn't use the veto. Joseph has talked about not wanting to see a Middle Eastern person, his words, be portrayed negatively, which was why he came onto the show, wanting to show his people in a positive light. So despite not even showing any of the adjectives that he was being described as, those negative adjectives and attributes were still thrown on him, unjustly. And it continued even long after he was evicted. And what makes it even worse is that under all this racial stuff that was happening, he was the only one who was evicted due to it. And what makes it even worse is that production under-edited him, they under-edited all of his talk about representation, and they kind of gave Kyle this sympathy PR run because CBS saw that it was more important for Kyle to be redeemed than showing how the people of color were affected by this, and even showed their journeys through it. They didn't show any of that type of talk. So even production didn't care to show his story about his purpose of being in the house, and his purpose of being in the house was used as a reason to evict him. So it just shows that even production has implicit biases, and there needs to be a lot of work done behind the scenes to improve actual representation. Several of the White House guests always get chance after chance after chance after chance to redeem themselves, but he never got that chance to redeem himself in the eyes of his fellow house guests, and that's just the typical journey of a person of color in the Big Brother house. When many people hear the term Asian, they usually automatically assume that the group of people or the person is East Asian. And with that in mind, it is not shocking to me whatsoever that whenever casting chooses an Asian person to be on the show, it is usually an East Asian person, since the group of East Asians have the most amount of numbers pertaining to people who were on Big Brother, compared to the other Asian groups in the show. Out of a severely underrepresented group, East Asian house guests are the most represented in this underrepresented group of Asians. Once we go throughout the house guests, you'll notice either some outright racism or very self conscious house guests trying to portray themselves in a certain manner so they don't disappoint their families or their people. So, we're going to talk about Curtis from Big Brother 1, and I don't remember much about him, but he consistently talked about wanting to be a good representative, so he was probably presenting himself in a certain way, not only due to the format of Big Brother 1, but knowing the pressure of being underrepresented minority on a huge platform like this. So next is G from Big Brother 4, and I think out of everyone, he might have received the most overt racist treatment out of East Asians. So he literally had racist comments said about him because he nominated Erica in the second week. And since the only thing she could find to insult him was about his race and nationality, it just showed how lowly she thought of him. But she could even use his personality as an attack. So there are a lot of Asian jokes that were made to him by many of the people in the cast, especially Justin and Robert, who were his closest allies in the game. They claim that it's all good and fun, but it has not aged well at all, and there is some truth to every joke. So while they might not have meant badly, it was still a microaggression. Anyways. So G also talked about his heritage, culture, ethnicity, and race a lot, and how he wanted to make his people proud. And we saw him do a Korean prayer for his deceased father, and everyone in the house helped him set it up and respected him for it. So the next person I'm going to discuss is Jin, and I don't recall there being any racist or borderline comment or treatment regarding her race that was given towards her. What did stand out to me about her is that she wanted to be seen as differently than G, pertaining them being Koreans. So to me, it kind of sounded like G was so proud of his heritage, his culture, ethnicity, and wanted to show it off, while June didn't want to be quote unquote that type of Korean person. She mentioned how G was the only Asian person she dated and is the reason why she only dates white men, and it seemed like she wanted to Americanize herself in comparison to him. So the next person chronologically is Angie, and there's nothing notable whatsoever pertaining her treatment in the house, her race, her ethnicity, so on and so forth, that was mentioned in the episodes or from any feed archives from what I have looked into. And here is Kevin from Big Brother 11 and Big Brother All Stars. I know he was in the video that I discussed black men under, but if a house guest is a double minority, they're going to be in both videos. So that's just a reference for future videos. So anyways, he had racist comments thrown towards him, but they were comments that didn't even pertain to his own race or ethnicity. The whole situation with Brayden and Lydia. And he saw how some of the other house guests reacted to it and how nonchalant some of them reacted to it, which pissed him off, essentially. And he still holds some resentment towards it. He was immediately placed on the out on both seasons he partook in, and I don't know if that was pertaining to his sexuality, his race or ethnicity, a combination of them, or other factors. There was a lot of discussion about race in Big Brother All Stars 2, and he was told by Devon that he wasn't black enough, or wasn't black because he's half Japanese, which he did take offense to. It was the same dichotomy that a lot of biracial people, not even just house guests, deal with on a daily basis where they feel like they don't belong in either group. So now we are moving on to Helen. In her season, there were a lot of racist jokes and outright aggressive comments that were made, and of course, that included Asian people as well, where they used to refer her as rice girl or a bunch of Asian stereotypes. Not much, if any, of these comments were said to her face, though, but since she knew that there are racist controversies that were happening during the season pertaining black people, and I wouldn't be surprised if she had a thought in the back of her head that her race had a part of how she was being treated and if there are being racial remarks made about her. So throughout the season, Helen went out of her way to appease to the others, and by the others, I mean the White House guests, and she acted like the racism was not much of a big deal during the season, but of course she got turned on very quickly in the early jury portion. And from how she reacted to Spencer a few years ago online, it seems like she kind of internalized a lot of the treatment she faced in the house and is more resentful about it now than she was at the time. So we're moving on to Paola from Big Brother 16, and there's nothing notable to be honest. Yes, she was nominated both times she was in the house, meaning she was nominated her entire 2 weeks in the house, but there's nothing indicating her race or ethnicity that contributed to how she was treated in the house. So now we are moving on to Alex from Big Brother 19. So there was the scandal about Jessica allegedly making derogatory panda comments about Alex, and of course pandas are in Asia, East Asia specifically, and making those comments obviously would tie into East Asian stereotypes. This turned into a huge misunderstanding and had Alex pissed off at Jessica initially, but she then was pissed off at Meg because she thought Meg made it up and essentially was playing around with race and dangling it in front of her. Outside of that, there hasn't been any other notable moments pertaining Alex's race that was mentioned or that took place throughout the season. Oh gosh, I can't believe I almost forgot to talk about Isabella, especially since there's quite a bit to talk about with her. She was initially brought into the Majority Alliance, but was also aligned with some of the outsider women like Kemi, Nicole, and Jessica. Of course, Bella threw them all under the bus to her Majority Alliance, but this Majority Alliance didn't really trust Bella either. Since she and Kemi were initially close, they ended up falling out due to Bella's messy gameplay and her complicitness in the racist comments and the microaggressions that Kemi was going through in the house, while adding curfew commentary here and there as well, especially as they argued in front of everyone. Bella was one of the minorities who tried to appease the White House guests the best that she could, but despite all of that, none of them trusted her, and they all wanted her out as soon as possible. It was not a coincidence to me that she was booted right after Camp Comeback ended, where all the other racial minorities were essentially booted already. And despite being the least threatening person out of herself, Nick, and Sam, she was the one that was booted first. And of course, once it was her time to go, the cast started unleashing their microaggressions against her, so she wasn't exempt from having that same treatment that the other people of color received in the season. And it also showed that Asian house guests are not exempt from having microaggressions thrown at them, which she definitely had to deal with. And from how she reacted post her eviction up to the present day, she doesn't really mess with anyone from the cast, and it wasn't an enjoyable experience for her. She reminds me a lot of Helen from Big Brother 15 with how they handled things in the house and having the same result happen. Unfortunately for her, it just happened a lot sooner than Helen. And the last person in the East Asian group is Derek from Big Brother 23. He did mention wanting to do the show for representation and that there was an alliance of all black people that were formed in the season for the same reason. But unfortunately for him, there was no other East Asian person in the house. And while there was another Asian person, she was kind of grouped into with the black people due to their similar goals, so he was kind of left on his own. Many of the fans complained about the cookouts not making it into a person of color alliance to include him as well as Alyssa, and people felt like him not being white or black directly hurt his game. It is ironic due to all the mess that is happening on this season. There was also the moment where Whitney made a racist comment about Asian people having small private parts and referred it to him. Of course, this is a huge stereotype that is given towards Asian men to desexualize them and to make them seem less masculine. So he had to deal with that in the season while he wasn't aware of it happening. So, as you saw, there are a lot of microaggressions and outright racism that has taken place with the East Asian house guests that have been on the show. And there's been a lot of mention of them trying to fit in with the white house guests and to represent themselves in a way where they don't stand out too much. But there are also a few of them who didn't have anything to talk about, but those were usually the people who went very early on in their seasons. In general, they suffer from the sample size being small. I also want to state that there could be a chance that some of the people I put under the East Asian list could be Southeast Asian. Some of them didn't really state what country they came from, so I just want to say that there could be grounds for error with some of the house guests that I've mentioned, specifically with the East Asian and the Southeast Asian. So I just want to point out that dichotomy right now, just in case I do make a mistake. So now it is time to talk about the South Asian Big Brother house guests. And looking at the list, it is pathetic that there are only 3 of them in 24 seasons and in 22 years. So it literally took them 20 seasons and 18 years for them to finally cast a South Asian person. I think that says a lot about the invisibility of South Asians in media and how, if there is Asian representation, it generally tends to be for East Asians. And the dichotomy I mentioned earlier about East Asians being the only ones seen as Asians compared to South Asians, I think that shows based off how Big Brother cast it as well. So our first South Asian house guest is Faysal from Big Brother 20. Like I said earlier, I can't believe it took 20 seasons and 18 years to get a South Asian house guest. So Faysal pretty much grew close to Swaggy almost immediately because they had a lot alike and the white male house guests didn't really care much for him, despite Faysal himself being half white. Of course, people didn't like that and they were seen as very intimidating together. But since Kaycee is also biracial with Asian and white, it is interesting to see how she was able to fit in with the White House guests more than Faisal did, though I'm wondering if gender played a part in that as well. So the main event that I specifically remembered is that Faisal and Haley were going through something pertaining to their showmance. Bailey and Roxanne were present, and then after they all just kind of like counted on him and he left, Bailey started making racist comments about him and other Muslim people because she didn't like something about his and Haley's showmance and insulted other Pakistani and Muslim women, as well as their men, pretty much claiming that the way they handle relationships is wrong, and it was just totally unnecessary. I also remember Angela running away from him as soon as she nominated him, and she wouldn't address him for days. Pretty much the same thing she did when she nominated Bailey, pulling off the "ooh, this scary POC" tactic BS that happens a lot in real life. So pretty much he was isolated in his final week, and he wouldn't leave the have-not room for days up until his eviction. Everyone would consistently call him scary and intimidating, despite him not having a personality that fits like that. But due to his height, stature, and race, that came with the package. So, a season later, in Big Brother 21, they would cast Envy. And he is one of the 3 South Asians who aren't mixed, so that's interesting as well. So I pretty much remember a lot of the house isolating and making fun of him during his sole week in the game as a competitor, and they made a lot of stereotypical comments about him as well, despite him cooking for them, cleaning for them, and trying his very best to please these people, but they all just made fun of him. And there were a lot of racial elements in the making fun of him. It also did not help that most of the people of color were evicted first and stuck in Camp Comeback. And in addition to that, people like Jack demanded the entire house to not talk to anyone who was in Camp Comeback, and the optics just looked very, very very awful. But despite that, a lot of the fans felt more bad for Nicole than any of the people of color who were also locked out during that infamous HOH session. And the last but not least is Hannah from Big Brother 23. And she is mixed with Indian and black. So I remember there were some people who thought that Azza did not initially include her in the cookout due to her being mixed race, though that is something that Azza denied. In the first few weeks, Hannah was on the outs of the cookout alliance, and we don't know if that's due to racial implications or because of her age, or because they didn't see the cookout as something serious at that point. I remember the producers focusing on her black side instead of her Indian side, especially since the cookout was a huge element of the season. We could have the discussion that if there were 6 Indian or 6 Asian house guests and there being 2 black house guests, one including herself, if she would have joined the Asian alliance and would have talked about that side more. So that's the dichotomy that she kind of had to face with during the season as well, and no one really talks about it. In a way, she essentially did have to choose, and because of that, she didn't get to talk about her Asian side more, though everyone in the house called her Chada, which is an Indian name, instead of Hannah. So it says a lot that there are only South Asian house guests came within the last 5 years and 5 seasons. Though if you compare it to Big Brother Canada, there are so many other South Asian house guests, and it's pathetic because this country, the US, has 24 seasons and Canada has 10 seasons and didn't premiere until 12 to 13 years after Big Brother US. It is interesting to me that 2 out of the 3 are mixed, though I don't know if that's something that they did intentionally. And the final group for Asian house guests in Big Brother USA are Southeast Asian house guests. Like I mentioned earlier, there are some others that were in the East Asian section, could be Southeast Asian, but that could just be a mistake on my part. So the 4 here are known Southeast Asians, and it's interesting that all of them are mixed. I believe Dominic is Filipino and white. Bridgette is also Filipino and white. Kaycee is Filipino and white. And Nicole is Filipino and Latin. So I found that to be very interesting to me. While Southeast Asian people are generally considered Asian more than South Asian people, there is still the issue of them generally being very invisible in the media, especially compared to East Asian people, and that reflects in the Big Brother USA casting pool in general. So, first I'm going to talk about Dominic. And now that I think about it, there really isn't anything of his journey in the Big Brother house that pertained to his race or ethnicity. But I think that's just because with mixed seasons, in general, everything's usually about the veterans and which veteran the newbie is associated with. So I don't have anything to talk about with him here. So Bridgette from Big Brother 18 is the only one that I actually have something to talk about. So I know she wasn't treated well by the house guests, but I don't know how much of it was tied to her race. Actually, yes, there is one moment that I remember. There was an incident where Zakia was talking about chinky eyes and doing the eye motions, so she was clearly making fun of Bridgette's Asian eyes. This has happened several times with some of the Asian house guests. Oh geez, I just realized I forgot to talk about James, since I wasn't sure if he was East Asian or Southeast Asian, and with the chinky eyes comment that I just made of Bridgette, a similar situation actually happened with James in Big Brother 18, where Paul and Bronte kind of just went off on this anti-Asian tirade about James and used his eyes to make fun of him as well. So what's interesting about James is that he was adopted by a white family, and I think some of his actions in the house were a result of him. While being Asian and knowing he's Asian, he grew up in a white family, so he wasn't as akin to his Asian culture and heritage. But I did notice that a lot of people felt comfortable going after James, especially the men like Clay, Paul, Victor, and even Polly in his 2 seasons. And I don't know if that's partially due to his race, his height, or just other factors as well. Okay, so I'm going to move on to Kaycee from Big Brother 20, and there really isn't anything that comes to mind about her race or ethnicity. Though I do find it interesting that she was able to blend in with the White House guests more than Faysal did, and I kind of discussed that earlier, especially with the level 6 side. And last but not least is Nicole from the current season of Big Brother 24. I also don't see how her race or ethnicity played much of a factor into her gameplay, especially since the Cookout 2.0 theory stuff happened around the time she was leaving, but it wasn't fully activated until the next week. But I do think someone like Kyle and a few of the others were more than willing to work with Danielle than Nicole or even Amira because of the races. So you could say that might have been an element that played a part in her journey in the Big Brother house, but that's really it. Unfortunately, there really isn't much of anything to discuss with Southeast Asian house guests, and this is really all that I could find. Hopefully, they cast more Southeast Asian house guests so they can have their visibility, so they can tell their stories and their perspectives on life and the Big Brother game, but we just didn't get that. So, in conclusion, while going through these 4 diverse groups of people in Asia, there's a lot of racism, a lot of microaggressions, and a lot of nasty antics that took place that they have went through in the house. And while there are quite a few of them who had nothing notable happen pertaining them, the fact that they're so not visible, even compared to Black Big Brother house guests, say a lot. I don't know if it's because there's the stigma that Asian people, no matter what, are too self-conscious to be on reality TV because they're worried about their image. So maybe that's how some people justify their lack of visibility. But I think it's BS and they need to be more open. These numbers, especially compared to Big Brother Canada, is just outright embarrassing. And it needs to be remedied. And it seems like even with the POC casting implementation that was placed a year ago, they still haven't made much, if any, progress towards their Asian house guests. And there are 2 last season that were cast, and 2 this season that were cast, but it was originally intended for it to be 1. So that is the video, and that is the journey that I could find of the several Asian house guests and the several types of Asian house guests and their journeys in the Big Brother house. I will be making a video on the Latin house guests in Big Brother, and it'll be interesting to see how that turns out. Thank you all for supporting and watching, and I'll be back with something soon.